Hello, everyone. Just letting everybody get into the room. I know it takes a minute for Zoom to let everybody in, so thank you so much for making time today. Um, Give it a couple more seconds and then we will get started. So thank you so much for joining this webinar. This is a community briefing hosted by Equality Arizona about this week's executive orders from Mr. Trump and how they'll impact the LGBTQ community and also other marginalized communities. As expected, Mr. Trump signed many harmful executive orders this week, directing the executive branch's departments and agencies to take actions that will harm LGBTQ Americans and many other marginalized and vulnerable groups of people. If this week is any indication, the policy, rules, and regulations that govern this nation will be changing at an incredible rate during the second Trump administration. We'll do our best as Equality Arizona to share accurate information with you about these changes. So please expect to hear from us often. This will be the first of many community briefings. And please give us grace as we may better understand the impact of these changes as time goes on. And so we're doing our best to interpret and understand them now, but please allow for evolution and for things to change over time as we understand them better. We know that so many people are truly afraid right now, especially trans, non-binary, and intersex people, along with immigrants and many other groups of vulnerable people in this country. We hope that you will not retreat from community if you're a part of these groups of people and our allies, but instead will lean into community, lean into support, and lean into getting involved with organizations that will help us all get through this challenging time. The most important thing we can do right now is to get organized, to hone our tools and skills and our understanding so that we're ready for the challenges ahead. And that begins with being informed with knowledge, right? Knowledge is power. So that you can understand the changes that are happening in the federal, state, and local government, and so that we can work in and outside of government to safeguard and protect ourselves and one another. So let's get started. I want to introduce you to the amazing people joining us today. First, Dr. H.L.T. Quan, a political scientist and political theorist, an author of Become Ungovernable, a recent book that is amazing, and an award-winning filmmaker whose latest documentary is called Queer, Broke, and Amazing, an incredible film that I hope will be showing at some point during the year, and also a board member of Equality Arizona. And Reyna Montoya, a documented social entrepreneur, community organizer, educator, nonprofit executive, dancer, and the founder, CEO, and board member of Aliento. Thank you both for making time today. I'm going to hand it over to you to share some opening remarks with our guests. You're both experts in this field, and I'm so grateful that you made time to speak with us today. So start with Dr. Quan. Hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you everyone for being here today. Please know that we cannot see you, so but we know you're there, and thank you. I also want to thank you, Michael, for your rapid response work and having the presence of mind to organize this briefing with less than 5 full days since the new administration took over. And I agree, please give us grace. I understand that it can be very unsettling, if not outright frightening, the swiftness with which the Trump administration has gone about to radically change many existing policies that are materially consequential and even fatal. From unilateral pronouncements about gender and geographies, however erroneous and preposterous, to declaring imaginary national emergencies, such as energy and the southern border, and withdrawing from the international environmental and health agreements, to reclassifying federal employee designations that could end up with tens of thousands of people, if not 100,000 people, being lost, being out of work, right? And rescinding the previous administration's executive actions, particularly those that sought to address institutional inequalities and past racial and gender discrimination, including discriminations against LGBTQ plus people. In all, there were 26 executive orders signed last Monday, and a few more before the week ended, not including memos from the State, Defense, Health and Human Services, Homeland Security, and Justice Department, as well as the Office of Personnel and Management with various directives from shutting down the Civil Rights Division in the Justice Department, basically putting them on deep freeze, and all DEIA employees, putting all DEIA employees on temporary paid leave with the promise of scrapping all DEIA offices, positions, plans, actions, programs within the next 2 months. And you may have noticed the A at the end of DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. The A is for accessibility. The A is for the ADA, which is the law of the land. So on Monday afternoon, it may have been just DEI, but by Friday morning, the memos coming out of the State Department and the Office of Personnel Management is already DEIA. So you could see it's encompassing many people who are differently vulnerable. Only last night, and without the required 30-day notice and reasons provided to Congress, the Trump administration fired at least 12 inspector general of major departments, including agriculture, commerce, defense, education, HUD, that's housing and urban development, interior, labor, transportation, and veteran affairs, as well as the Environmental Protection Agency and Small Business Administration, making very clear the point that this administration will not be accountable for its many, many actions. In fact, the New York Times reported this morning that perhaps as many as 17 inspector generals have already fired. There's so much information that's not known. So there's no transparency and there's no accountability. So there are clearly many executive orders and directives that are more consequential than others. So I think one of the things we want to think about is it might be helpful to organize them in general areas. And I think there are at least 5. Those that target, for instance, the federal workforce, the one that I was talking about earlier. Those that target immigration and the southern border, which will include refugees and asylum, and that also obviously include the queer, the trans queer people who are seeking asylum and refugee status. Those that target transgender people, women, and people of color. So civil rights rules and programs that sought to address inequities, past and existing race and gender discrimination, and various DEIA initiatives. Those that target energy and environment. Those that target trade, tariffs, and international relations, including war funding and foreign aid. Now, there are something that, yeah, okay, so they rescinded 78 of the previous administration's executive action. And something like, say, the abortion gag order for foreign aid, although they're suspending all foreign aid for 90 days pending evaluations. That's like a political football. They go back and forth between different political party. And so that's something that happens just about any time the different party take over the White House. But there are something that are extraordinary and extensive and consequential. And I think it is really important that we unpack them and that we inform ourselves with the ways in which they impact real people, real communities, and how harmful they are. I think that it would be helpful to dispense with some of the funny jokes and things. It's not that I don't believe in humor. I think humor is really important. I think humor may get us through in the next 4 years. But I think obsessing on the fact that they got sex wrong, that the past and present and future sex is female, that's really great, but that is a distraction. It really does not get to the details of how horrific that single executive order is, targeting not only trans people, but policing gender and policing gender expressions and realities. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Quan. I know I always learn so much from you, and I'm so glad that we have you in this time to help us understand the political ramifications of all of these executive orders. Reyna, I'll hand it over to you next. You are such an amazing leader in our community. I know I always look to you for guidance around how to be an active ally and supporter of immigrants and people who are here to make this country the amazing place that it is. Immigrants have always been the backbone of this country. So I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for all the amazing work that you all do. And Dr. Quan, thank you so much. I'm also learning a lot from you. It's such an honor to share the space with you all. I think that something that is really critical to understand is that you all are like allies for sure, but also we have so many of our LGBTQ community that have multiple identities that are also identified as immigrants and that they have different statuses. I think that in immigration, something that I want to make sure that we're contextualizing maybe for folks that don't understand is typically three main buckets of immigrants here in the United States. Is one of the buckets is folks that are legal permanent residents that are in their weight or potentially ability to become citizens, or folks who have been naturalized. And there's the next second bucket of folks that are in temporary status, meaning that can be TPS, that can be DACA recipients, that can be visas, that can be so many different type of immigration status that you are technically have some legality to be here, but that can be contingent upon so many decisions, whether if it was congressional mandate, whether it was an executive order. So I would say that that's approximately 1 million people that are in that like temporary limbo. And it expands depending if we're accounting visas as well. And then we have the other category, which is the unauthorized or the undocumented population. So I would say that that's a big spectrum about who is going to be impacted by this or not. And then if we add an extra layer of that is US citizen children of undocumented people. We probably heard a lot of controversy and a lot of outrage around one of the first executive orders that came out this week was around really ending right citizenship. That has precedent for many, many years. So I think the way that we are seeing it as a community, it has two folds. It has two pathways. One of them, it'll be really, really difficult to peel back the Constitution. They would require a constitutional amendment. So if it goes through regular process, it would need congressional action, and then the president would have to sign it. That it would require, as I mentioned, it would be very, very difficult to repeal it that way. The other strategy that we're seeing coming from the Trump administration is being able to do this litigation. We already saw a judge that withhold that. We all were here talking about allyship with Roe versus Wade, that it was the law of the land for many, many years. I don't want to create any fear or anything within the community, but it is very worrisome that they're even utilizing the fact that indigenous communities were not citizens to really fight back and trying to repeal this right citizenship. So I think that that's going to be something that will develop. I feel that the Constitution, it is very clear that if you were born here in the United States, you should be considered a U.S. citizen. But the Supreme Court, that's something that we'll have to wait and see, because at the end of the day, their power is to interpret the laws and the intent of them. So I think that that would be more developments, but I perceive that that would be a big, long legal battle ahead of us before to do. So in the meantime, what can you do? What can you say to folks? One, if they are people that are pregnant at this moment, their children would still be U.S. citizens. They should be U.S. citizens. If they are being denied anything like that, please come to places like Equality Arizona, so that they can redirect you to partners to ensure that if you want to pursue a civil rights litigation, because they would be violating your civil rights. The other component is to ensure that don't let fear really overcome you. I think that part of the Trump administration, what they're really banking on us, is that we're scrambling, that we're in chaos. And there's going to be two components. I really appreciated how Dr. Quan framed it, right? It's something that is going to have immediate impact in our communities, and the other component that is going to have more long-term ramifications that we're going to have to a little bit like wait and see about how it develops. From an immigrant perspective, something that we have already seen, there's been so many panic around rates, rightfully so. The Tom Homan, the appointed voter czar by the Trump administration, has said that they're not going to be respecting sensitive locations. So sensitive locations are churches, places of worship. It also includes schools and hospitals. Here in Arizona, unfortunately, we know what that's like. I remember being a teenager and having sheriffs outside near schools, like in Crossroads. I remember folks being deported from their hospitals beds right after they were stabilized. So unfortunately, we have seen that in Arizona, but then now it's nationwide. So part of the whole tactics that we're seeing is by attrition. They want to make conditions so unbearable that people self-deport. As someone who is formerly undocumented, who still has DACA, it is protected by that temporary status. I think it's really critical that we equip families, that we equip folks, friends, and loved ones with the resources. So at Aliento, we put out a toolkit to ensure that folks know their rights, regardless of immigration status. Know that if the hospitals are sharing immigration status information, they're violating HIPAA. So they shouldn't be doing that unless you give consent or unless they have a judicial warrant. The same thing goes for schools. If your child or the student that you know has not given consent, or the parents have not given consent to share that information, schools are prohibited, K through 20, they're prohibited from giving that information because they will be in violation of FERPA. So it's really important that we understand our rights. The main thing that people will become vulnerable to is, one, if they come in contact with law enforcement, that becomes challenging because then that can develop into more for them to inquire about immigration status. In the state of Arizona, as of now, even though that Proposition 314 passed, they cannot implement asking for immigration status. So right now, if you are stopped by police, you only have to identify by your name and your date of birth. Other than that, that's something that even if they ask you, even if they're nice and they promise you the moon and the skies, or maybe they use intimidation tactics, you don't have to do that. We are encouraging folks to enforce their constitutional rights, that regardless of immigration status, everybody has constitutional rights, and they can say that they don't want to share that information unless they have an attorney present. So I'm going to pause there because I know that there's a lot to unpack and uncover, but if I want to summarize, is remember that all people here in the United States still have constitutional rights. Some agencies like ICE will deceive people, will lie, and their job is to the poor folks. So it is important to understand how people can become vulnerable to that, and encouraging people to mitigate the exposure. I was with a group of students and I was telling them, right, it's like we can control when they're going to be doing operations. We can control if they're going to be doing raids. We cannot control how Trump and his folks are going to be behaving this administration. What we can control is how we act, how we show up for each other, and to ensure that we're not giving them anything for us to be in violation of our constitutional rights. So I'm going to pause there, Michael. Thank you so much for having this conversation.
My goodness, thank you so much, Reyna. I mean, so much information and folks on the call. We've got a big audience, friends, and so please know that you can use the chat and the Q&A if you've got questions. I know we've already covered a lot of really meaty stuff. I'm going to switch to a quick slide deck just because I want to share a couple of things specifically about the scope of executive orders, because I think this is really important. And so, executive order sounds really scary, right? And they are far-reaching, and they are going to have big implications for our lives, but I want you to understand how and why. And so executive orders, these are how the president of the United States manages the operations of the US, the federal government, right, in terms of the executive branch. He's in charge, he's the head, the CEO, right, of the executive branch of government. These directives, they're given by the president to determine how to enforce the law and to otherwise manage resources and staff of the executive branch. they are subject to judicial review, and they may be overturned if the orders lack support from statute or the Constitution. So like Reyna was just saying, there will be judicial challenges to so many of these executive orders because they are in violation of the Constitution or existing statutory law. So executive orders do not have the authority to override the U.S. Constitution. They do not have the authority to override federal statutes, statutory law, and they do not have the authority to override established legal precedent. So all of these things are really important because we are going to need those three facts to fight back against these executive orders that do violate our constitutional and civil rights. Just so you know, the executive branch has just about over 4 million employees, including the armed services. There are many departments that make up the executive branch, from agriculture to defense to veterans affairs to transportation to state to labor, right, justice. All of these are a part of the executive branch. There are independent agencies like the CIA, like NASA, right, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, and the vice president and the cabinet. So that's the actual makeup of the executive branch. And so, as you can imagine, I mean, 4 million employees, that's a lot of people that if their job is deemed related to DEIA, may be out of work, right? That will be significantly impacted. So this is going to have an impact not just on our constitutional and civil rights, but also, or attempts to override those things, although I don't think they will stand, but also on our economy. So this is there is a lot to cover here, and I want us to dive a little bit into the anti-trans executive order. And so this was one of the executive orders. Its official title is Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. So an absurd title. This executive order does attempt to erase trans, non-binary, and intersex people from federal law and policy. It instructs agencies and departments to defy Bostock, which was a Supreme Court decision that essentially defined discrimination on the basis of sex to include sexual orientation and gender identity. This denies that trans people and intersex people exist. It says in the language of this executive order that it is false to claim that males can identify as and thus become women and vice versa. It also implies some changes to Title VII. So this will change how the EEOC behaves in terms of civil rights claims, and it will likely impact federal funding. And so this now, the federal government officially only recognizes two sex, male and female, and says in this executive order that they are assigned at birth and unchangeable, which that is, not biologically true or scientifically true. So there's a lot happening in here in terms of this executive order. So some things to know, some further things to know about this executive order. Some places where it has immediate impact are repealing protections for people who are incarcerated and are trans, non-binary, or intersex. This will require these folks who are incarcerated to be housed incorrectly within these facilities, and that's both in federal prisons and in detention. So folks that are trans will no longer be respectfully housed by the government, or they've been instructed to not house them appropriately. And it bans necessary medical care for trans, non-binary, and intersex people. So anything that's deemed gender affirming care will no longer be available to folks. We do expect these to be challenged significantly, especially under the 8th Amendment, right? This is cruel and unusual punishment. If I were to be arrested and was denied the hormones that I've been on for more than half of my life, that would have very serious medical impacts and be something that should not be legally allowed. So there's other things to discuss with this, but I think one of the scariest things also, we can discuss passports, but one of the scariest things I want to ask our panelists about this is the way that this law really so uses these sort of very narrow parameters to define sex. Clearly that has an impact on trans, non-binary, and intersex folks, but I think that has an impact on other people too. I mean, I feel like this is bad for everyone. What do you all think of this? What are your interpretations?
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, please.
Well, I think absolutely. And I think that's the thing, is that these some of these, as I said, we can organize the many executive order in general categories, but they also have overlapping implications. And so I think if you take this in combination with the freezing of or defreezing the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, and also it's really important to understand that expenditures for all activities have been frozen, except all the hiring have been frozen, except for immigration, right, and border security. So that's the military, and so to the extent that so much of the so-called administrative state is now being reconfigured to essentially propping up a national security state that includes particularly focusing on the control of immigration and the borders, particularly the southern border. You see the state is being remade. And so all of the work that of civil society, any remnants of the welfare state, quote unquote, in other words, anything that has to do with the well-being of the people and not just the well-being of the government, right, is essentially have been deemed immaterial or actually a problem. And so when we put this executive order in that context, and so there were several specific causes, how sex was defined as an individual immutable biological classification as either male or female. Sex is not synonym for and does not include a concept of gender identity. So it clearly announced that sex is not gender. And then it defined man and women and girls, and man and boys and boy, and female and male. And I want to get to the paragraph F on gender ideology, because I think that once you understand this, you understand how capacious, how encompassing this executive order is. Quote unquote, gender ideology, the paragraph reads, replaces the biological category of sex with an ever-shifting concept of self-assessed gender identity, permitting the false claim that males can identify as and thus become women and vice versa, and requiring all institutions of society to regard this false claim as true. Gender ideology includes the idea that there is a vast spectrum of genders that are disconnected from one sex. Gender ideology is internally inconsistent in that it diminishes sex and as an identifiable or useful category, but nevertheless maintain that it is possible for a person to be born in the wrong sex body. And then paragraph G follow up with that by saying gender identity reflects a fully internal and subjective sense of self disconnected from biological reality and sex and existing on an infinite continuum that does not provide a meaningful basis for identification and cannot be recognized as a replacement for sex. This executive order is defining what human beings are by fiat. All of us, in our various way of expression, is being defined, but by implication, all of the work that people have done, be they biologists or psychologists or anthropologists or women and gender studies specialists or feminist scholars or migration scholars, their work are deemed, if those that happen to use the language of gender to help us understand the complexity of humans, are now deemed as potentially a problem and potentially targetable. Because if then you look at the memos that have been coming out of the State Department and the Office of Management and Personnel that tell people that it is their job to report any individuals and activities that have anything to do with DEIA, that there is their job to report. So they're asked to snitch on And however much we enjoy that one anonymous call, because of course these anonymous calls are filling up the hotline, and one of them, which I have to report because that's my job, I'm reporting, says that, they have a really credible evidence that the vice president and the president of the United States, in fact, were hired on the basis of, solely on the basis of their race and gender and privilege. And therefore, they should be reported. And that's really funny and that's really great. Except that, and like I said, humor will get us through. But in reality, what this administration is seeking to do is to essentially, on the one hand, making the state really just focusing on the military, on homeland security, on policing, right? And on the other hand, anyone who is doing any work for the well-being of the citizenry and its populace in civil society are deemed targetable. And so this is going to not just affect trans and queer people. I think that would be a very limited way of reading this, but this would affect all of us, right? And particularly women, because there is no question that I think they gave away the game when they say defending women from gender ideology. That is the first 3 4 words of this executive order.
I couldn't agree with you more, Dr. Quan. I think that there could be far-reaching implications for this executive order. It's signaling a shift in thinking, the way that this administration and thus the federal government will think of human beings. And that's not just about trans people in regard to gender and sex. This is going to have ramifications for women that could set back the women's rights movement very significantly. I mean, arguments around the natural category of women were used to keep women from voting for a very long time, keep women out of medical schools, right? Keep women out of professions. I think this also has implications for the lesbian, gay, and bisexual community because it does set up this right and wrong, this natural versus unnatural. And we know that that's the exact same framework that was used to criminalize lesbian, gay, and bisexual people for hundreds of years in this country. And so I'm very concerned about the way that this executive order is setting up a framework to not only exclude trans people from the law, but to reintroduce segregation and criminalization of people around sexual orientation and gender identity, not to mention the potential for that also happening around race and national origin. And so, Reyna, do you have any thoughts on this?
If I may add, I think that the other component, and this is where we see a lot of parallels, something that happened last week, the Senate and the House passed the Lincoln Riley Act, that they also utilized it in this framework about defending women, right? Defending women from the threat of immigrants. And now it's gonna most likely become the law. President Trump most likely will sign it. And what is really worrisome about this piece is that folks can just be accused of doing shoplifting, stealing a pen, or stealing diapers, and you don't even have to do it. You just have to be accused. So then this is going to open the door for continuous discrimination. It's going to increase domestic violence. It's going to increase just the palpable fear of people potentially being abused and not wanting to do anything because they're going to be turned over. So we're really concerned that this framework is having not only with this specific executive order, but it's that key strategy that they're trying to do to really separate us. The fact that I want to really echo what Dr. Quan mentioned, that what they're really trying to do is to report your neighbor. We're seeing it with immigration. We're seeing it with the LGBTQ community. It's really putting us against each other and really making sure that we are in a society that we are turning our neighbor rather than supporting each other. I apologize. That's my dog. He's a little rowdy. Then the other thing that I would say that is very concerning about this from an immigration lens is that unfortunately there are a lot of countries that discriminate against our LGBTQ community, especially our trans community. There are still countries that it is illegal for you to be gay, and that is very concerning because a lot of the asylum cases or refugee cases of the LGBTQ community were won on those bases, and now this leaves a huge question mark about about it, about what's going to happen. Our trans folks are going to be able to win these immigration cases where their life was at risk and at danger. So that's something that we're very concerned.
That's such a good point. I mean, there are so many asylum seekers from countries where it is illegal and perhaps you receive the death penalty or very serious punishment for being LGBTQ. What will happen to those individuals now under this administration? Um, these are such important things to understand, and so many things that we're only going to understand in the coming months as we see how these executive orders are actually institutionalized, right? How they actually play out within the mechanisms of governing. Something I want to touch on really quickly is identity documents. This is really important to the LGBTQ community, the trans community in specific, the intersex community, non-binary community, and to immigrants and all of the ways that we overlap. So having identity documents that reflect who you are is something that I think a lot of cisgender and heterosexual people take for advantage or take, for granted. So we already know that Secretary of State Marco Rubio already instructed the State Department to stop issuing X gender markers on passports, and also ordered that all passport applications for passports that are seeking to change a gender marker should not be processed. So there's a freeze on all of the gender markers, the X gender marker applicants, and the applications and renewals of people trying to change their gender from male to female or female to male. And so that's really important to understand. That's going to impact a lot of trans people. I know that before the rules were changed, for more than a decade, I couldn't leave this country because I couldn't get a passport that that reflected legally my correct gender and name. And so it's also important to note that passports, visas, and global entry cards have been ordered by Secretary Rubio to only accurately reflect sex. So again, if people are trying to access those documents that are transgender, it looks like that will not be possible at this point. We're not entirely sure how far-reaching that's going to be. So far, the White House press secretary press secretary has stated that existing passports and federal documents will not be revoked, but we don't know if that will hold because that's just the press secretary has said that this week. And so we know that those things can change as they are operationalized in the government. And so this is going to have far-reaching impacts on identity documents that are available to Americans, to trans, non-binary, and intersex people. Can you both speak a little bit to that, of the importance of having identity documents? I mean, Reyna, I know being documented makes a huge difference in your life, whether you can work and participate in civil society.
Go ahead, Reyna.
Yeah, it's been heartbreaking to hear those news and to see where we are as a nation. It's as you mentioned, it is your day to day, right? Like from going to, I always go back. As soon as I turned 21, I was so excited to make a meal for my parents, and I went to groceries, and I had part of the recipe was to really marinate the meat in wine, right? And I was excited. I was like, I'm gonna surprise them. And then I'm at the grocery line, and then I give my Mexican passport because that's my nationality. This was before DACA was in existence, and they wouldn't take it. And it was like just those little things that made me feel so inferior, that made me feel so disempowered, that I think it's, as you mentioned, we take it for granted sometimes about the day-to-day actions that we're able to do, and that just make you feel that you belong and that you're part of this community. So we're really concerned about the ramifications that it's going to do. We also know that a lot of our Gen Z community identifies as part, like almost half of them identify as part of the LGBTQ community. So this is going to have real ramifications in the day-to-day lives, that we're worried about. Also the mental health implications that are going to come with it. There's the legal aspect, and then there's a societal aspect and the individual component about folks constantly feeling that they don't belong, constantly feeling that no matter what they do, they're never good enough, and that there's something inherently wrong about them. So this is something that is just heartbreaking, and it is critical that as we're thinking about resources and really standing being in solidarity with one another, we are also able to provide trauma-informed care and emotional healing and therapy work.
Thank you, Reyna, for saying that. It's so important to understand that these are just merely legal, right? That this has to do with policy and legal, and that they don't even cover anything to do with people's emotional state and the affective dimension, how people's lives are affected on a day-to-day basis, their psychological, mental health, well-being. So first, with respect to the gender, the targeting of gender and eliminating any kind of recognition of gender status, and that obvious, and given that asylum is essentially shut down right now, so that means that it is working toward, this executive order is working toward essentially eliminating trans queer people using discrimination against, so transphobia, homophobia, death threats, all of those things based on their gender identity, sexual identity as legitimate category for refugee asylum status. So that's one issue with respect to document. I think it's important to put this in context. As Reyna said, a lot of our young people actually identify as gender non-binary. For the first time, we have, I think, something like 25% of the youth identify as gender non-binary. Now, that doesn't mean that they are trans. It just means that they're non-binary. It means that they want to think more themselves as more complicated and more complex and more fluid. And so that is and then as they, and in that, that's going to have effects on their well-being, right? So, and we know that trans and queer youth experience the highest rates of suicide. Something like 40% of all youth suicide are trans queer, and that population is a small fraction of the larger population. So that's the context. I want to say that and as you said, Michael, yes, if you are already currently have X gender on your documentation, that will not be revoked. The likelihood of when you have to go renew those documentation, that if you have to do it within the next 4 years, my money is on you not going to get it renewed, right? So there's that's a pretty sure bet. But there are other implications because there are agencies and institutions that are funded by federal grants. And because federal grants are now have to conform to this executive order and other executive order that's specifically targeting DEIA, what that meant is that the university themselves, so the hospital themselves, may choose to then not recognize, even though you have legal status. I think that's something we need to think about as well. I'm not trying to scare folks, but I'm trying to say, look, here's an advisory I received today as a faculty. Until such time as you receive specific guidance from funding agency, if a project include DEI component, outreach or activity, your project contain explicitly outlined DEI goals, we recommend pausing these immediately unless you have other sources of funding to cover the work. Funds previously allocated for DEI activity on your grant must remain unspent and cannot be reallocated to other budget categories. And so we need to, wealth rarely trickle down, but often pain trickle down so quickly. And this is, come on, this is less than, 5-6 days since all of these things coming down. And here we are already. You remember desegregation, Supreme Court order, 1955, 1970, people were still fighting against busing. And now we are fighting, trying to actually, fight against resegregation. So there are things that this country moved very slowly, like civil rights, like voting rights, like desegregation. And then there are things that move very quickly, like anti-affirmative action, right? Like anti-DEI. It happened really, really quickly. So I think it's important to understand that a lot of this also will operate at the local level. And this is why what Reyna was saying earlier is that we have to be in community. We have to work with others, and we have to make sure that we have each other's back.
So true. I want to say a little something about pre-compliance. Dr. Quan, I think the note that you just read to us about the university saying stop before you're told to stop. It's really important to not be compliant in advance. And so yes, when my passport, expires, it may not be renewed appropriately. I would not then renew it because I don't want documents that don't reflect who I am. But I won't surrender my passport. Like, you're gonna have to take it from my cold dead hand, quite frankly. Like, it's not gonna happen. So, let's not be pre-compliant. Don't anticipate these things. Don't change your gender markers or anything about how you live before you have to. And so, for those of us that have changed our documents to male or female, or even to X, don't surrender your documents now. Don't give them to anyone. We don't need to be doing that. And so, it's only in situations where we don't have a choice, that we make the choice to either be compliant or not. And so, this is a time to not give in preemptively. And so, I think that the most likely scenario for those of us who have changed our identity documents is when we do go for renewal, that they will be held up in some way. And that's a scary thing because those identity documents, we use them for everything, right? In the grocery store, to access many different things. We're using them all the time, plane travel, traveling across state lines. And so that will change people's lives. And so please don't encourage anyone to be compliant in advance, to do any proactive changing of anything. And so, all
Michael, and
right.
if
So,
I
yeah.
may, this is not only going to impact, as you mentioned, like federal agencies or state agencies, like universities or places that are funded by the federal government. We already seeing it with corporations. Target already pulled all the DEI. So, like, don't support them. Like, this is like, I think that oftentimes we feel so powerless and we feel like all the attacks that, yes, are real, but I think we're brilliant people that we can hold complexity and like multiple things at once, and like don't support them, like really making sure that they see the consequences. If they're not gonna be for us, then we have to show up that we're not gonna be for them, right? And we have to hit them in their pockets as well. There are gonna be some private companies that are gonna be making, either out of fear, even if we want to give them the benefit of the doubt, there might be many whys. It would be the pre-compliance stage, as you were mentioning. They might be afraid of themselves being targeted, but I think that this is our opportunity to really link arms and stand in solidarity with one another.
Yes,
Michael,
absolutely. Yeah. Go ahead.
may I just read what you have on one of your plate, which I think
Sure.
is really it's really important that folks understand this in light of your comment and Reyna's comment about not being compliant. And so the anti-transgender executive order does not, and it does not make it illegal to be transgender, non-binary, or intersex. It does not change the reality that trans, non-binary, and intersex people have always existed and are a normal part of human diversity. It does not ban or make illegal Medicare. Oh, where was it? Sorry. Uh, it does not ban or make illegal Medicare for transgender, non-binary, or intersex people. It does not make it illegal for family, friends, schools, or workplace to support transgender, non-binary, or intersex people. And that's, I think, Reyna's point, right? Is that we have to support each other. We have to get organized. We got to do this work.
Absolutely. And we should be very cognizant of, these are changes just to the federal government right now, right, to the executive branch,
Mhm.
but that does, as Dr. Kwan said, pain trickles down, right? And so universities, state governments, private businesses, right, for-profit businesses are going to take a cue from the federal government and make some shifts in the way that they treat people of all vulnerable identities, I think. And so we need to be aware of that and start getting organized. Voting with our wallet is always important, as Reyna pointed out, and just getting ready to challenge these things, even though it feels like fights we've already fought, because we have, but you know, we need to keep at it and organize together for this next wave. We have a couple of questions. I think I answered the ones I think about identity documents. We have
I think
one
so.
about will identity documents be impacted for folks who are trans and US citizens who are living abroad on temporary visas? I think Reyna's answering right now, but I think the answer is most likely yes, especially if you're trying to renew those visas. They will likely not be renewed for you appropriately. There's already been a halt on visas, passports, and global entry for trans folks. So something to be very aware of if you're not living in this country right now. We're all going to be impacted by this. Reyna, do you want to?
I would say on that too, like I would encourage folks to talk to their attorney as soon as possible, whoever supported them. I am not an attorney, I am not a legal expert on that, but that would be the assumption. I think it's still too soon to tell, but I think it's going to be mostly impacted when you have to renew it. So that's something to be mindful of.
I totally agree with you. If you're in any of these situations, consult an attorney immediately. Litigation will be it will be a very important strategy as we fight these executive orders on all fronts. I'm gonna promote folks to I'm gonna let them be visible so that we can start talking. But and if you have any more questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. I know for some reason the chat's not working, so I don't quite understand that. Here we go.
May I
Okay.
say a couple
Yes,
things?
please do.
As I want to make sure that we understand that we're drawing from the World Health Organization,
Right.
declaring a national energy emergency so that we can do mining projects and do more drilling, rolling back energy efficient regulations, eliminating all environmental justice programs across the government, which really meant to deal with poor communities of color who have been targeted for decades for dumping and excess and pollutions. All of that will affect all of us in small and extraordinarily big way. And then there are, you know, actions that are being done in our names that will have extraordinary consequences. That all foreign aids have been suspended except to Israel, right? That the ban on the 2,000-pound bombs has been lifted. That has consequences globally. I'm glad Mexico is standing up to the United States and its imperial kind of trajectory. But I think the world is paying attention. I think a lot of people are paying attention. Just by way of concluding, I would just say that I know this is a lot, and it is overwhelming, and it is even demoralizing. But I think it might be worthwhile to note that Donald Trump is a petty tyrant, is a vindictive tyrant. I think I'm not saying anything that the newspaper haven't said, and these are corporate newspapers. His administration is an authoritarian one, is an autocratic one. Both him and the administration are more competent than they were 8 years ago. They came in, they had a plan. The plan was 2025. So more likely things will keep happening. Please know that this is only one of many policy briefings that we will be doing throughout the foreseeable future. Earlier this week, I ran across a column by Ben Radestoff, who is a democracy defender, who have observed authoritarian regime for a while. And he offered 4 very basic questions to help us prioritize our attention and energy, because it can be exhausting and it can be demoralizing, because so much is happening. So here are the questions, and you might want to write it down, okay? Is the action tangible, actionable, and detailed? This is the action coming from Trump or his administration. Or are they intangible, abstract, or vague? Or I would ask, is it theater? Second, does the thing causes irreparable harms to real people? Third, does the action target the opposition in a way that may cause anticipatory obedience, the kind of compliance that Michael was talking about earlier? Finally, does this entrench the authoritarian faction in power and make it more difficult to dislodge? You know what the answer yes or no mean to you. And that's one way to harness some of your energy. But I also want to share that earlier this week, I had the privilege of speaking with 2 old-timers. They're longtime social justice warriors. They're feminists, they're Chicanas, based in Tucson. And they, in their words and deed, reminded us that not only that we can make gain even in defeats, but more than ever now, we have to fight and we have to live. And we can only do that in community. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Quan. So powerful. Reyna, do you have any closing thoughts for us?
I just want to say that it's a very difficult and challenging time. It's only been 5 days. Unfortunately, I know that as we mentioned, it can be very heavy, but when things are happening, to remind ourselves that there's been people who have fought very hard injustices in this country, and we need to make sure that we stay vigilant, that we stay together, and that we are supporting each other with our resources. So know that you're not alone. You have a community that is backing you up in look at the fact that Michael Soto was able to put this together with the whole organization in 5 days. Like, that should be applauded. And in moments of isolation, please reach out. This is too hard to navigate alone. It is really critical that we don't let them take away who we are as humans, and that we don't get caught up in this game of turning into each other, because that's what they want. They want us to turn our backs to our neighbors, and we can't let that happen.
Yes, thank you so much, Reyna. I could not agree with you both more. This is a time for us to live more fully, to not be afraid, and to stand with one another. We are not the enemy. We're not here to hurt each other. We are neighbors and friends and family members and colleagues, and we need to remember that more than ever in these days and stand with each other. There's one more question in the chat. I know we're at time, so if you've got to go, feel free to go. But a question about oh, I actually think it's gone. Okay, I don't see it. Monica, you unmuted. Do you have a question that you wanted to ask?
No,
Okay.
my I can't unmute. I can't mute myself. I don't know. I can't.
Okay.
Nothing's working on mine. So sorry.
I'll
I'll try to
mute
be
you.
quiet.
Okay. Okay, no worries. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for participating, for learning. We're going to be doing these community briefings a lot. The next one will be on what's happening at the state legislature here, and we will continue to do briefings on developments with the federal government as well. So Dr. Quan and Reyna, thank you so much for being here with us today. I truly appreciate y'all and just have learned so much from you, and always just want to be in community with you. So thank you for being here, everyone. Have a good weekend and stay safe, be well, and we'll see you hopefully again soon at other briefings. And we'll be sending this out so that you can have the recording. I'll share a slide deck that has even more information. Please think of Equality Arizona as a resource. We're here to help you and to build community with you in this time.
Thank you. And remember,
Okay.
hang in there, and you're not alone.
Yes, exactly. We've got each other. Thank you, Reyna. Thank you, Dr. Quan. Thank you, everyone who joined us. So good to spend time with you this evening. All right, everyone. Goodbye.